Julia was a lively young woman, just 21 years old, whose life revolved entirely around fun, friends, and freedom. Raised in suburban America, she had grown up believing that faith was something outdated, a relic of the past. To her, religious beliefs felt restrictive, more like rules designed to steal life's joy than to enrich it. Her parents had never stressed the importance of spirituality. Their Sunday mornings were for coffee on the porch, reading the newspaper rather than attending church services. Julia's daily routine was filled with hours spent browsing social media, catching up with her friends at coffee shops, and enjoying late-night parties that lasted until sunrise. She would often jokingly dismiss conversations about God or faith as fairy tales or wishful thinking, preferring to talk about fashion, music, or movies. Deep down, though, Julia occasionally felt an emptiness, a strange, hollow feeling she could never quite explain. Yet whenever these moments came, she swiftly filled them with distractions, turning on the television, texting friends, or finding something fun to do. To Julia, eternity was an abstract concept, too distant, too uncertain, and too inconvenient to worry about at her age. Even when older relatives gently urged her to consider spirituality, she politely smiled and changed the subject. After all, at 21, she believed she had all the time in the world to ponder life's deeper questions later. Julia's world was one of instant gratification, modern conveniences, and carefree independence, and it never occurred to her that this world could suddenly change. In her comfortable and modern American life, she thought she had everything she needed, yet what she didn't realize was that something vital was missing. She never anticipated that beneath the laughter and carefree facade, a dark, mysterious force was silently waiting, ready to confront her when she least expected it. Julia's journey would soon reveal to her that the spiritual realm she had dismissed was far more real and far more terrifying than she ever imagined, forever altering the life she had so carefully constructed. The day that changed Julia's carefree world forever started out as an ordinary Saturday afternoon in her small suburban town. She and her closest friend, Sarah, decided to stroll downtown, past familiar landmarks, like the old brick library on Main Street, the corner diner famous for its homemade pies, and the quiet church Julia had passed by countless times without giving it a second glance. It was a beautiful spring day, the kind when American neighborhoods come alive with children riding bikes, parents tending gardens, and older folks rocking gently on porch swings, watching the world drift by. Julia and Sarah walked slowly, sipping iced coffees, their laughter ringing out against the hum of traffic. They talked about everything and nothing, gossip from social media, plans for upcoming vacations, and the latest hit songs on the radio. As they approached an intersection near Maple Avenue, Julia's phone buzzed. Looking down to check the notification, she laughed and showed Sarah something amusing on the screen, completely distracted from her surroundings. Neither of them noticed the red traffic signal above, nor the 18-wheeler barreling toward the intersection, its driver frantically honking the horn in a desperate last-second warning. In an instant, everything slowed down. Julia heard the truck's horn, a long, terrifying blast, and glanced up, her heart freezing with fear. Time seemed to stretch unnaturally, seconds turning into minutes. The enormous silver grille loomed just feet away, and her friend's scream echoed like a distant echo, haunting and distorted. Julia tried to move, but her body felt paralyzed, rooted to the pavement, as if held down by invisible chains. Then came the violent, bone-shattering collision. Her body was thrown into the air, weightless and helpless, as the world spun wildly around her. Glass shattered, brakes screeched, and distant cries of bystanders filled the air. Then, suddenly, darkness consumed her. For a moment, there was nothing, no sound, no feeling, only a cold, silent void. Then she found herself strangely detached, hovering above the scene of chaos. She could see herself lying motionless on the pavement below, arms bent unnaturally, her blonde hair matted with blood, her once bright eyes staring blankly into nothingness. Sarah was sobbing hysterically, kneeling beside Julia's lifeless body, crying out desperately for help. Paramedics rushed toward them, sirens piercing the calm afternoon. Julia felt a surge of panic, an instinctive desperation to rejoin her body, to make sense of what was happening. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't move toward her body. Something invisible was pulling her away, slowly and deliberately, as if guiding her into another reality entirely. The world faded into darkness, growing colder with every passing second. This wasn't the peaceful transition Julia had imagined from the movies. There was no tunnel of comforting white light, no gentle reunion with lost loved ones. Instead, she was being drawn downward into a vast, limitless void, filled with whispers and shadows. Strange, distorted voices began to murmur her name, their tones twisted and sinister, sending chills through the core of her being. Fear, unlike anything she'd ever known, gripped her heart. These voices laughed cruelly, mocking her confusion, whispering that she belonged here now, in this terrible darkness, forever. The shadows around her shifted and writhed, forming monstrous shapes that circled closer and closer, eager to claim her. Julia's entire soul trembled with horror. She was utterly alone, helpless against forces she couldn't comprehend. She tried to scream, to fight back, but she had no voice, no power, only pure, helpless dread. Just as the darkness seemed ready to swallow her completely, she felt an even more powerful presence, ancient and evil, approach her, unseen but overwhelmingly real. Its hunger radiated through the darkness, oppressive and suffocating. Julia knew instinctively that whatever awaited her here was unimaginably horrific, far beyond her darkest fears. Then, just as the darkness closed in, a single, powerful voice shattered the oppressive gloom, speaking clearly and with authority. Enough. Immediately the shadows recoiled, shrieking angrily but retreating as if burned by a greater power. Brilliant, radiant light pierced through the darkness, illuminating everything around her. Warmth flooded her soul, chasing away the icy grip of fear. Julia was lifted upward, pulled gently but firmly from the abyss, toward something infinitely stronger, something that felt like safety, love, and truth itself. As the darkness dissolved, she emerged into a space filled with indescribable peace. Before her stood a figure unlike anything she had imagined. It wasn't the gentle, distant Jesus she'd seen depicted in paintings or movies. This was a being of incredible majesty, authority, and compassion. His eyes were filled with kindness, yet tinged with sorrow as he gazed deeply into her. She instantly knew, beyond doubt, that she stood face to face with the very truth she had spent her life dismissing. Julia realized in that extraordinary moment how tragically mistaken she had been, and that the carefree world she had known was only a small, fleeting part of a far greater, eternal reality. Julia stood trembling before the presence she knew instantly was Jesus, awestruck and shaken to her core. Here, in this realm beyond life, nothing was hidden. His gaze penetrated deep into the corners of her soul, illuminating secrets she'd long forgotten and truths she'd stubbornly ignored. In the gentle yet powerful light of his presence, Julia felt her life unfold around her like scenes from an old movie projector. Every moment vividly replayed, every decision laid bare. She saw herself as a young child in Sunday school, half-heartedly coloring Bible story pictures she never truly believed. She saw her teenage years, full of youthful rebellion, rolling her eyes whenever anyone mentioned God, laughing at church-going neighbors, and dismissing faith as nothing more than a comforting fairy tale for the weak-minded. Each memory brought with it a heavy ache, A burden she could now clearly see had weighed upon her silently for decades. She saw moments when friends had gently invited her to attend church, times when her elderly grandmother had softly urged her to open a Bible, moments she now recognized as divine opportunities, all casually brushed aside. As each scene unfolded, Julia felt an overwhelming sadness. It wasn't anger or condemnation radiating from the figure before her. Rather, it was a sorrowful compassion, profound and deeply personal. Jesus did not speak immediately, allowing her instead to experience the weight of her choices firsthand. Every instance of prideful dismissal, every opportunity lost to arrogance or indifference was shown to her. Not simply as memories, but as moments in which she'd unknowingly turned away from the very peace she now so desperately craved. Tears streamed down her face, though she was unsure how she was able to weep in this spiritual state. She realized now that she'd carried an emptiness her entire life, trying to fill it with worldly comforts, friendships, entertainment, wealth, but never truly finding fulfillment. In that instant, she recognized that the emptiness had always been spiritual, an inner void she had tried, unsuccessfully, to ignore. She looked into Jesus' eyes and felt the question burning inside her. Why had she refused him, when all along he had gently and patiently waited? Then, in the tender voice of one who deeply understands human frailty, Jesus spoke, saying softly, "You have lived your life chasing happiness, but true joy was always closer than you imagined. You've often asked yourself why you felt incomplete, why despite success, family, and friends, you always experienced an emptiness. You believed faith was burdensome, that surrendering your life to me meant losing freedom or happiness. But you failed to see that true freedom can only come from knowing your purpose and your Creator." His words echoed gently yet firmly, revealing the depth of her misguided beliefs. Julia's heart ached with sorrowful regret. She longed desperately to undo all the lost opportunities, to reclaim the countless chances she'd ignored. Jesus continued, his voice filled with infinite kindness. "My child, your life was never meant to be spent wandering through darkness. I sent so many to guide you, friends, neighbors, even strangers, yet your heart remained closed. You chose worldly pleasures and distractions, believing them to be enough, but they never truly satisfied." Julia felt each word pierce deeply into her soul. All the years she had wasted came rushing back, vividly clear in this divine presence. She recalled her elderly grandmother's prayers, her loving words always encouraging her to find faith before it was too late. Now, standing before eternity, Julia understood exactly what her grandmother had meant. The life she'd known, with all its comforts and fleeting happiness, was but a brief moment compared to eternity. Yet she had squandered it chasing things that would never fulfill her, never realizing that each day was a precious opportunity to embrace the true purpose of her existence. As she stood there in divine judgment, not harsh and condemning, but profoundly truthful, she saw clearly that her life had been built upon an illusion, a foundation of sand that had swiftly crumbled beneath her feet. Then, gently but with sobering clarity, Jesus showed her something else. He turned slightly, extending his hand outward. The radiant light surrounding them shifted, revealing a terrifying scene of darkness, fire, and anguish below. She stared in horror at a realm so dreadful it defied description, a place of eternal hopelessness and torment. Countless souls engulfed in despair cried out endlessly, their voices full of unimaginable pain. Julia recoiled, her heart filled with terror and remorse. She understood instantly that she had briefly experienced that very place of darkness after the accident, before being drawn upward by Christ's merciful voice. Jesus looked at her, compassion radiating from his gentle eyes as he spoke softly yet gravely. "This is what awaits those who live their lives apart from me. Those who choose darkness over the light, who hear my call but refuse to answer." Julia's soul shuddered as she fully comprehended the weight of his words. The carefree existence she once valued seemed utterly meaningless now, overshadowed by eternal realities she'd spent her life denying. Yet even in this moment of stark truth, she sensed deep mercy. Jesus looked at her again and gently spoke. "You were given this glimpse not because your story is over, but because your mission is about to begin. The world is distracted, and time is short. Many, like you, live without truly understanding what awaits beyond their earthly lives. They chase after things that vanish like mist, ignoring what truly matters." He paused, letting the importance of his words sink deep into her heart. "Julia, you must return, but not to the life you once knew. You must go back and warn them before it is too late." His command carried both urgency and love. Julia realized this wasn't simply a vision. This was a calling, a second chance few would ever receive. She had seen eternity, felt the profound emptiness of a life without God, and witnessed the terrible consequences of ignoring truth. Now, she understood clearly that her life's purpose had changed completely. She was to awaken others from the comfortable slumber that once bound her own heart. The mission ahead would be difficult, perhaps painful, but Julia knew she had no other choice but to accept it wholeheartedly. Julia felt a powerful force pulling her away from the overwhelming vision, yet she resisted, desperate to remain close to the comforting presence of Jesus. She reached out, instinctively longing to stay in that warm, radiant light. But she was falling backward rapidly, spiraling down through an indescribable void. Her heart raced with panic as she struggled to hold on to the peace she had experienced. But in a heartbeat, that peace evaporated into a deep, oppressive darkness that surrounded her once more. The comforting brilliance she had briefly known faded, replaced now by shadows so thick and sinister she felt suffocated. There was no air to breathe, no ground to stand upon, only a blackness so intense it seemed to have physical weight. This darkness was different than before. Far worse, colder, and frighteningly alive. Julia's mind screamed out, her thoughts swirling in desperation as she tried to cling to the reassuring memories of Jesus, the warmth of his compassion, the depth of his love. But the darkness around her actively resisted these memories, pressing against her consciousness, drowning out hope with fear. Suddenly she realized she was no longer alone. A presence was near, invisible yet dreadfully real, emanating raw hatred and malice. She tried to turn away, but there was nowhere to turn, no way to escape. In this pitch-black void, direction held no meaning. She heard whispers, dark murmurs that slithered like snakes through her mind, repeating every regret, every sin, every mistake she'd ever made. They taunted her relentlessly, mocking her with cruel laughter, reminding her of every wasted opportunity and every careless dismissal of faith. She knew then what she was experiencing: the chilling absence of God's presence, the desolate reality of separation from the source of all hope and life. Fear gripped her soul tightly as the dark whispers intensified, becoming louder, more aggressive, and frighteningly personal. "You belong here," the voices hissed maliciously. "You chose this darkness, and now it has chosen you." Julia wanted to protest, wanted to argue that she didn't know better, but deep down she knew the truth. She had always known enough to choose differently, yet she had stubbornly turned away. The darkness pressed closer, and with it came an unbearable sense of despair. It wasn't merely emotional pain, but a profound spiritual agony, deeper and sharper than any physical pain she'd known in her 72 years of life. The comfort she'd once found in worldly achievements, the modest home she'd proudly maintained for decades, her carefully nurtured garden in the backyard, her grandchildren's laughter filling her living room on lazy Sunday afternoons. All now seemed impossibly distant and utterly insignificant. She knew, with stark clarity, that no earthly comfort or memory could penetrate this abyss, nor could it bring her relief from this spiritual torment. Here, stripped of all illusions, she faced the terrifying consequence of a lifetime spent pursuing temporary joys instead of eternal truth. She cried out in desperation, though no sound came from her lips, only a silent plea echoing through the infinite darkness. "Lord, save me. Don't abandon me here." At once the whispers ceased, and a heavy silence hung thickly around her, oppressive and menacing. From the shadowy stillness, a figure emerged, not clearly visible but discernible as a towering, shadowy entity. It had no distinct form, yet its very presence radiated malevolence. As it approached, Julia felt an icy coldness that pierced straight through her being, draining every ounce of warmth and courage. The shadow hovered near, and she felt its invisible eyes examining her, reading her soul with cruel satisfaction. It spoke slowly, the words dripping with contempt. "You were given every chance, yet you ignored them all. You laughed at those who believed, mocked faith as weakness. Your pride led you here, and now you shall remain forever." The entity's voice was hollow and ancient, filled with a malice older than humanity itself. Julia, filled with dread and despair, recognized what stood before her. It was not merely a shadow. It was an embodiment of darkness, a spiritual force bent on capturing her soul for eternity. Yet even in this darkest moment, Julia remembered the kindness in the eyes of Jesus, the sorrow in his voice as he spoke about the blindness of humanity. She summoned every ounce of faith and courage left within her, desperately crying out again, "Jesus, please, save me." As the name left her heart, the shadow recoiled violently, pulling back with an anguished hiss, unable to withstand even the mention of Christ. Encouraged, she repeated his name, each time feeling strength returning, each time driving the darkness further away. Suddenly, in the distance, she saw a faint point of light, small but growing brighter and warmer, cutting through the suffocating darkness. It expanded rapidly, engulfing her in a wave of brilliant clarity and peace. The shadowy presence screamed in defeat, retreating deeper into the abyss as the radiant light enveloped Julia completely. She gasped, suddenly aware of the sensation of air filling her lungs, her heartbeat pounding furiously in her chest. The darkness vanished, and Julia found herself back in her familiar hospital bed, nurses and doctors rushing frantically around her, shouting medical jargon as machines beeped erratically nearby. Her body trembled, overwhelmed by confusion and relief. "She's back," someone shouted urgently. "Julia, can you hear us?" Her eyes fluttered open slowly, blinking against the stark brightness of fluorescent hospital lighting. Sarah stood close by, tears streaming down her face, whispering prayers Julia had once dismissed as meaningless. A doctor leaned over, examining her pupils carefully, astonishment clear on his face. "We lost you for nearly 8 minutes," he said, voice filled with both shock and awe. Julia couldn't yet speak, but her eyes filled with tears of gratitude. She knew her experience was not a dream, nor a hallucination brought on by medication or trauma. It was a divine wake-up call, a merciful second chance. As she lay quietly in bed, gently gripping her daughter's trembling hand, Julia felt a resolute determination deep within her spirit. Her life's purpose had been rewritten, a clear mission set before her. She had witnessed eternity firsthand, glimpsed both heaven and the horrifying reality of separation from God. Now she knew exactly why she'd been sent back. Julia understood, with unshakable clarity, that she could never again live as she'd lived before. She was being called to share her story with everyone who would listen, to warn others of the dangers of ignoring faith, and to lovingly invite them to embrace the truth she'd once scorned. And she vowed silently, in the quiet hum of hospital equipment around her, that for whatever days remained, she would dedicate herself entirely to helping others see the truth before it was too late. The hospital room had long since emptied of urgent footsteps and worried whispers, but Julia remained wide awake. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly above her, casting a pale glow across the clean white sheets. She had returned, alive, but everything inside her had changed. The memories of what she'd seen beyond life's veil remained vivid. The radiant presence of Jesus, the suffocating darkness, the voice that had mocked her, and the miraculous rescue. It wasn't a dream. It was more real than anything she had ever known. After a week, she was discharged. Her body was still weak, but her spirit was on fire. Every breath she took reminded her that she had been sent back for a purpose. Julia was no longer the carefree 21-year-old who had once laughed at matters of faith. She had crossed a threshold and returned with a message burning in her heart. The first person she tried to talk to was her roommate, Marissa. Sitting on the edge of her bed, Julia shared everything: the vision, the shadow, the return. She expected awe or maybe tears. Instead, Marissa blinked slowly, then let out a soft, uncomfortable laugh. "That's wild," Marissa said, trying to sound supportive. "Maybe it was just the drugs. You were in a coma, right? The brain can play crazy tricks on you." Julia felt a deep ache in her chest, not from Marissa's doubt, but from the fear behind it. She recognized it. That same fear had once lived inside her too. But she didn't stop. She brought up her experience during a casual brunch with old friends. They politely nodded as she spoke. But one of them, Derek, a guy she used to party with, leaned back and said, "You're talking like some televangelist now. Next thing you know, you'll be handing out pamphlets in the park." Laughter followed. Not cruel, but dismissive. Julia felt her cheeks flush, not with shame, but with sadness. They didn't understand. Still, her resolve only deepened. She started waking up earlier. Instead of scrolling through social media or planning her next outing, she read scripture and prayed. She asked God for strength, for clarity, for courage. She posted fragments of her testimony online, not in long rants, but in simple reflections about the light she had seen, the love she had felt, and the warning she'd received. Most of her posts were ignored. Some were met with sarcastic comments. A few were blocked. But then came a private message. "Hey," it began. "I've been struggling with anxiety and this weird fear of dying. I saw your post and, I don't know, something about it hit me. Can we talk?" Julia's heart leapt. It was happening. In the weeks that followed, more messages came. Quiet ones, hesitant, anonymous. Some from people she'd known in passing, others she didn't recognize at all. One girl, a freshman named Kylie, confessed she'd been considering suicide before reading Julia's story. Another said they hadn't believed in anything until now. Yet with each soul she reached, the resistance grew. Julia began having vivid nightmares, cold, oppressive dreams where the shadowy presence returned, whispering lies into her ears. "You'll be mocked. You're crazy. No one will listen." She would wake up trembling, drenched in sweat. But every time she called out Jesus' name, the darkness fled. Some nights she would cry quietly into her pillow, asking God why it had to be so hard. But deep down, she already knew the answer. Truth was never meant to be easy, but it was always meant to be shared. She wasn't a preacher. She wasn't a theologian. She was just Julia, a 21-year-old who had encountered the eternal and returned to speak about it. And though the world around her was still skeptical, still afraid, She understood something they didn't yet know. The time was short, and the call was urgent. So she kept going. One conversation at a time, one post at a time, one soul at a time. And somewhere deep within, Julia knew. This was just the beginning. Julia's days quickly grew busier after those first few private conversations. What began as whispers and cautious questions turned into regular visits. One or two people at first, then more. By the end of the month, her living room had quietly transformed into a place of gathering, a sanctuary not built of stained glass and vaulted ceilings, but of truth, warmth, and urgency. People came at dusk, at dawn, between errands and after dinner. Some brought casseroles, others brought heavy hearts. Most carried questions they were afraid to ask anywhere else. What did you see? Is there really a place of darkness? Can someone like me be forgiven? Julia listened without judgment, her words calm but passionate. She didn't preach, she testified. Not from books, but from the raw imprint her near-death experience had left on her soul. Each time she recounted the terror of that abyss, the suffocating blackness, the taunting whispers, the spiritual agony. She watched the skepticism on their faces melt into silent reflection. It was as if the spiritual realm she'd once dismissed had awoken, and through her, was now awakening others too. But Julia quickly realized that the darkness hadn't given up on her. At night, the same chilling presence she'd met in that void returned, not physically, but through her dreams, her thoughts, her fears. It whispered again, not as clearly as before, but just enough to remind her it still watched, still hated, still hoped to silence her. The more people she reached, the stronger the resistance grew. Some neighbors began avoiding her entirely. One Sunday, a man from her old church confronted her gently but firmly. "Julia, I think it's time you move on. These stories, they're unsettling people." She smiled, but her eyes did not waver. "It's not a story," she replied. "It's a warning." The true battle was spiritual, and Julia knew it. Ephesians 6:12 became her daily meditation. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood. She wasn't just speaking to doubters. She was fighting against a darkness that thrived in silence, confusion, and apathy. But she would not be silent. She lit candles during prayer meetings, not for ambiance, but as a symbol that light still pierced darkness. Her worn Bible, marked with trembling hands, lay open on her coffee table, a sign to anyone who entered that this house now served a higher purpose. One afternoon, a young woman named Rachel, only 19, came to see her. Her voice trembled as she spoke of anxiety, depression, suicidal thoughts. Julia took both her hands and spoke with the clarity of someone who had walked the edge of eternity. "You are seen. You are loved. And you were made for more than this pain." That night, Rachel stayed for dinner. The next morning, she joined their prayer circle. The darkness didn't disappear, but Julia had learned its limits. Every time she spoke the name of Jesus, whether in prayer or trembling defiance, its power faltered. Every soul that turned toward the light weakened its grip. Soon, word spread beyond the neighborhood. A pastor from the next town over called and invited her to speak. She was hesitant at first. After all, she was no theologian. But something inside her reminded her. She didn't need a degree to share the truth. She had seen it. Julia stood before a small congregation that Sunday with trembling hands and a steady heart. "I'm not here to scare you," she said. "I'm here to beg you not to wait. Darkness is real, but so is grace. So is mercy. So is the hand that pulled me out when I had nothing left." By the time she returned home that night, a dozen more messages had come in. Some skeptical, some curious, some desperate, but all seeking something beyond the surface life they'd built. Julia looked out her window, past the porch light, into the quiet dark beyond. And she whispered aloud, as much to the night as to her Lord, "I will keep going. As long as I breathe, I will not stop." As the years quietly unfolded, Julia's once youthful stride slowed, but her fire never faded. Now in her early 70s, she carried herself with a serene authority, no longer the carefree girl from years before, but a woman transformed by truth, touched by eternity, and burdened with a sacred mission. Her once bustling house had become a spiritual refuge. Neighbors, strangers, even skeptics now knocked on her door seeking guidance, comfort, and truth. Her living room, lined with books and softly lit by sunlight filtering through sheer curtains, often echoed with the murmur of prayers and heartfelt confessions. She no longer sought applause or validation. What mattered now was impact. Souls awakened, hearts softened, and lives redirected. Conversations once filled with laughter over fashion or films had been replaced by deep, vulnerable dialogue about meaning, eternity, and hope. Julia had no pulpit, no title, no broadcast. And yet, her voice carried. It carried into nursing homes, hospital rooms, coffee shops, and quiet park benches. Those she spoke to didn't leave with entertainment. They left with conviction. But the mission came at a cost. Some former friends had distanced themselves entirely, unable or unwilling to face the gravity of her testimony. Others mocked her still, calling her the miracle lady, or worse. Even within her extended family, there were whispers, tensions, and polite sidestepping of anything spiritual. Julia bore it all with grace. Her eyes no longer flinched at rejection. She had seen what lies on the other side, both light and darkness, and nothing else compared. Still, at night, she sometimes felt it. The familiar chill, the return of spiritual pressure, like a fog pressing against her window panes. Sometimes it whispered, other times it screamed. But Julia had learned. She no longer trembled. With a steady voice, she would simply whisper, "Jesus," and peace would return. Her impact deepened. A local youth pastor invited her to speak at a small gathering, and though hesitant at first, she agreed. The night she shared her full story, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Young people, many jaded by the hollow promises of modern life, listened with wide eyes and trembling hands. Some knelt afterward, not out of obligation, but desperation. A spark had ignited. Letters followed, emails, phone calls from people she had never met. "Julia," one letter read, "your story woke me up. I had one foot in the darkness and didn't even know it." Another woman arrived at Julia's porch in tears, saying, "I think I was where you once were, and I need to change." Julia never boasted. She knew it wasn't her. It was the truth itself, the truth she'd once rejected, now using her life as a living parable. She had become the warning, the testimony, the final wake-up call to a world asleep at the wheel. And then, one day, she knew. The gentle voice in her spirit, the same one that once whispered, "There's no time to waste," now said, "Well done. Rest soon." That morning she brewed her last cup of tea, just as the sun began rising beyond the maples in her front yard. She sat by the window with her journal, writing not just her reflections, but a message. One last letter to be read at her memorial. A week later, Julia passed peacefully in her sleep. The town mourned, but also remembered. At her memorial service held in the church she once never would have entered, a crowd gathered, young and old, believers and skeptics, all touched by her unwavering faith. The pastor read her final letter aloud. In it, she wrote, "If you're hearing this, I've gone home, but I leave behind this truth. Eternity is real. Heaven is real. And so is the darkness that tries to steal your soul. I know because I've seen both. And I beg you, don't wait. Don't gamble with your soul. Jesus is not just a name. He is the way, the truth, the life. I wasted years chasing the temporary. Don't make the same mistake. I share this not to scare you, but to love you. I was given a second chance. You may not get one. A silence fell over the room. And in that stillness, Julia's voice carried once more, cutting through time, echoing across hearts, warning, inviting, and lighting the path home.